Devs blame gamers for brutal expectations. Whole studios are disintegrated, and the corporations have decided that you no longer own your own games. Here we go. In part 1 we talked about the gaming industry as a whole, how early access gave rise to the larger studios releasing unfinished and broken games, the old model of make a great game, make money, predatory nature of modern monetization practices, and the way influencers are used to hype up games regardless of the actual quality. In this video we're going to be trying to hone in on just exactly what went wrong and what we can do to help change things. In order to know where the gaming industry is heading, we first need to look to the past. Video games, once described as a passing fad, is now said to be bigger than the movie and music industry combined, and it's still growing. The very first iterations of computer games ran on hardware that cost thousands, and was really only to showcase what could be possible. Then, in the 70s, arcades that had primarily featured mechanical-based games started to see video games enter the space, like Pong from Atari or Pac-Man by Namco. And make no mistake, like today, profit was the driving factor in making these arcade machines, and the increased difficulty of some of these games, a controversial topic at the time, pressuring you to spend extra money for those much needed lives. It was providing an experience that couldn't really be found anywhere else, though it wouldn't be long before that experience would need to enter the home. Enter the consoles. The Atari 2600 would be released in September of 1977. There are many other similar and copycat consoles that would ultimately fail to succeed. This would also be the first time that third-party developers would form their own companies to make games that would run on existing consoles, after a dispute between Atari and its engineers over pay and recognition of their work.
These engineers would create a software program that would result in $20–30 million in sales. And they were making this little paltry salary, and they figured, gee, I'd like to get a penny or two or three per each cartridge.
So we go to the president of Atari and point that out, and he said to us, and I'll quote, he said, "You are no more important to that game than the person on the assembly line who puts it together."
They would go on to form Activision. However, it wasn't all up from here. Now, with hundreds of companies trying to cash out on the growing popularity of console games and make games of their own, the quality of those games dropped dramatically in favor of profits. And other than word of mouth, there weren't many ways to know whether a game was good or bad before you'd already bought it. This loss in consumer confidence in console video games would lead to the great video game crash of 1983. Primarily focused in America, sales dropped dramatically and even arcades saw a decline. The hype had come to an end.
Video game sales have gone tilt. The boom simply isn't booming anymore.
If Pac-Man, E.T., and Raiders of the Lost Ark aren't selling, what will?
And something else was happening at the same time that we also see today. Once you've played something enough, the novelty wears off. People were getting bored of these games. However, over in Japan, a little-known company continued the research and development of new games that would still be iconic to this day. Nintendo. Having already gradually made success in Japan, they turned their sights on the US, who were still reeling from the crash of the gaming market, and soon after Europe and elsewhere. The NES breathed new life into video games by marketing itself as a completely new entertainment system, with more strict controls over third-party video game development to regain the consumer confidence that was previously lost. A new technology that was comparable to what you would find in the arcades, a host of new games that they'd already established, many of which would still be known to this day. At the same time, another Japanese company were also pushing their way into the gaming market with various consoles of their own. Sega, who first released the Sega Master System, and then with their Sega Genesis, or Mega Drive as it's called, outside of the US. And so by the 90s, with Sega and Nintendo's home consoles, as well as various popular handheld consoles, the console war could begin.
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does.
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does.
Get Joe Montana free, Pat Riley free, Buster Douglas free, Super Monaco GP free, or Collins free. What Nintendo?
Meanwhile, PC games took a while to catch up, with it being much more expensive to own a PC, issues with piracy, PC games generally being marketed to an older audience, having more complex video games, and the lack of porting programs between the different systems. The Commodore 64 and IBM's personal computer would eventually help solve these issues, and so heading into the 90s, the gaming industry had gone through its beta phase, and it's learned from its many mistakes. Gaming had now fully established itself, with complex design, gameplay mechanics, story, music, and multiplayer, a healthy level of competition driving creativity and innovation, as well as competitive prices for both hardware and software, and exponential growth in technology, from the 8-bit systems to fully 3D graphics, and later the release of the mighty PlayStation 1 in 1995, PlayStation 2 in 2000, and the Xbox in 2001, and arguably a time of some of the best video games to ever release: Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, Mario, Sonic, GoldenEye, Zelda, Pokemon, Halo, Gran Turismo, Grand Theft Auto, Battlefront, Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Kingdom Hearts, Hitman, and PC gaming had finally caught up, with The Sims, SimCity, Diablo, Age of Empires, COD, Battlefield, Fallout, Command & Conquer, Warcraft, StarCraft, Baldur's Gate, Half-Life, Doom, Quake, Unreal Tournament, Roller Coaster Tycoon, so many more. The late 90s and early 2000s, to me, truly was the golden age of gaming, and many franchises saw some of their best releases during this time. The problem with this great boom in video game sales is that it showed the business world that there were massive profits to be made. The early video game companies had proved that there was a massive multi-billion-dollar market waiting to be tapped into, and this shifted the way that games were monetized. The old model of a studio making a game as best they can, offering a demo, or as it's now called, early access, and then selling that product and making money based on how good it is almost all but forgotten, especially when it comes to the bigger titles. Before, making a good quality game and the profits were directly linked. They were one and the same. As we discussed in the previous video, marketing for games before the internet primarily came down to magazines, word of mouth, and demos, especially for the younger generation. And then you had a demo or the finished product to play. That then had to impress you or your friends, and you would encourage each other to get it. You didn't make a purchase on hype alone. This all changed as the internet became more widespread. Now, carefully edited around trailers and gameplay videos showcasing the only 30 minutes of the game that actually worked can be instantly beamed across the internet several months before the game is actually released.
Welcome to the next generation of open world adventure.
And rather than waiting for either you or your friends to try or buy the game and see for yourself firsthand whether it's actually good or not, or even a complete and finished product, you're now expected to cough up a month's rent months before the game is released and tell the world how excited you are. Influencers stepped into the role of friend to be used by publishers to hype up games long before we have them in our hands and could make the determination ourselves, and then play and stream the game afterwards talking about what scams they are until the next one comes out. This, coupled with the massive push on pre-order and early access incentives, have shifted that model of make a great game, reap the rewards, to release videos, hype up the game as much as possible before the player can actually try it.
We've greatly enhanced our crowd and community systems to create the most believable city in any open world game to date.
Give content creators cash and codes to play the pre-release and hype it up as the next big thing, and incentivize as many people as possible to pre-order the game before they find out it's a big bag of and then just be like, whoops, sorry.
Insomniac has done an incredible job providing a consistent experience.
I'm gonna work my butt off to become Hokage!
But some people don't care. Like this guy from my Do Not Pre-Order Star Wars Outlaws video. He's like, what? $200 for a slightly different looking bike skin that no one but me will see in a game that isn't being released for another decade? Sign me up. Also, can you take a shit on my face? Before we move on, we'll be looking into more topics like this in the future, so please subscribe so you don't miss it. This is a tiny channel, so it really helps. Now, most people have a high-speed internet connection, and it's required for many games, even single-player games, which means studios can release a game that's clearly unfinished, but that requires an internet connection to even play, and use this to upload patch after patch to try and finish the game in their own time, maybe, if they feel like it. And it doesn't matter to them if they've already got your money from pre-order. In fact, I'd bet the only real reason that they continue to develop the game after release is so they can bring you back to spend more money on the battle passes and loot boxes and skins, DLCs, season passes. And yet another side effect of widespread internet is that with more access to game creation tools and publishing platforms like Steam, almost anyone has a chance to try and make a game and sell it as an early access title. This indirectly normalized unfinished buggy games being released at full price, and then being continually worked on after you've already paid for it. And no one took more advantage of this situation than the big AAA titles and studios. I can't tell you how many times I see comments on social media and YouTube saying this is just how it is now. Well, why? It didn't used to be. Older games going back to the PS1, PS2 era and before weren't always perfect, but it's nothing compared to what we have now. However, there is a positive to all this, as those once smaller companies have grown into empires and gradually swallowed up the competition and mutated into massive corporations. It's opened up an opportunity once again for the smaller studios of today trying to get off the ground, a chance to go back to the old model of gaming, not only benefiting from the profits of making a great game, but also getting free marketing and support directly from the people that are actually buying and playing these games. Your customers, allowing them to make bigger and better games and so on and so forth. A new chance to gain the trust and confidence that's been lost by the bigger companies, and have players screaming, yes, this is what we want. While some AAA titles are actually losing money, and eventually this may catch up with them, and it already has in some cases with massive layoffs and whole studios being shut down. The big companies took those hits but then made up for it in other areas. The point here is the loss in customer confidence doesn't seem to have been enough for them to really make a change just yet. This leads us to our next point. We've known for a while now that there's something not quite right in media in general. Not just in games, but TV, movies, books and magazines. It's becoming more and more noticeable, and more people are starting to ask the question, are products being made to try and keep up with popular culture, or is popular media being used to attempt to influence culture? TV, movies, books, games, and the people that make them have always been influenced to some degree by the culture. And you can see this if you look at games made in the early 2000s, or the 90s, or the 80s, and so on. There are lots of different themes. Media had us thinking in different directions or asking questions that we wouldn't have asked. But now, more and more, games and the gaming articles written about them are trying to push conversations and arguments that no one really asked for. These aren't emerging from average people in their day-to-day lives. Now people are looking more deeply into these groups, not just at the types of people that are behind them, but also at the money changing hands. Recently, some people clued into the fact that independent organizations were being contracted by gaming companies to make sure that the stories they tell and the characters they use conform to a predetermined narrative that ties in with these various agendas. This isn't necessarily the fault of the gaming companies themselves. To avoid the bad PR of saying something wrong or offending one of these groups, and being the subject of a smearing or cancel attempt. In any case, the end result of this process is that people are noticing it, and some games are receiving huge pushback for playing into this. Not because they agree or disagree in one way or another, but because it's so obvious to them that something's been changed, not because it's a good creative choice, not to make a great game, but in order to keep in with the people who have the agenda and push a narrative. And that's not why people play games or consume media in general. They don't want this shoved down their throat. And again, many of these so-called issues have already been explored in games in far more creative ways than they are now, in the context of that particular game universe, rather than trying to tack on real-world issues and jam them into the game. And we're seeing the negative impact that it's having on the gaming industry as a whole. It makes you wonder why gaming companies are prepared to take a risk at making a game in that way that an ever-increasing portion of gamers don't like and don't want. It seems like trying to influence a generation of younger people is more valuable than taking a hit on the odd game here and there. It does seem to be the largest and most popular franchises that are at the center of this. But once again, this has presented an opportunity for smaller game studios to separate themselves and just focus on being creative and innovative with their games. This perhaps brings us back to what the purpose of playing games is all about: having fun.
Legendary escape.
Houston, we have a problem.
The hype and the fear of missing out has been a growing problem in gaming for years now. It's not a recent issue. Some people said I went too easy on streamers and YouTubers in the last video, but the truth is that while I'd like to see more responsibility taken by content creators when they hype up a game to be the most amazing, insane, the best game ever made, and then like a month later they're not even playing it anymore and never speak of it ever again, it's probably not going to happen. Yes, one, because they're often sponsored to promote those games, and just like the game companies, money is always going to be a factor. And they aren't going to get those sponsorships if it doesn't benefit the company that's paying them. But also for those content creators that have made it their job, they spend almost all day, every day playing games. Many of those games are going to get completed fast or get boring quickly, and they're going to move on to the next thing. It makes it more difficult to give an honest and accurate opinion. And there are some creators that do refuse work with certain companies or brands because they don't believe in promoting that product.
I've been contacted by gamer supplement shit. I've been contacted by energy drink bullshit. I've been contacted by Raid Shadow Legends. I've been contacted by all of these different companies, VPN companies, all this. And you know what I tell them every time? I tell them to go eat sand. Because I'm not going to sell you something that I think is dog. You don't need energy drinks to sit on your ass watching a streamer. You don't need a VPN because it doesn't make you safer. The only thing it does is lets you have an endpoint that is different on the internet so that you can go and access different services from a different part of the world. You don't need it. And you don't need to play Raid Shadow Legends because you should love yourself and stop paying into a system like that just rips you off as a player instead of giving you a good game. Bullshit. All of it is bullshit. All of it. And I refuse to take their money because it's worthless.
And those are the people that can encourage others to do the same and not just jump on the bandwagon of hype. We had a similar issue when talking about tech content creators. It's not whether they're good or bad people. I'm sure ethics of this situation does come up. From the viewer's perspective, we need to shift the responsibility back to us, understand how it works, and not be led by content creators because we think we can trust them. Just view what they do as entertainment, enjoy that side of it, and if you want, show your support to people who don't just promote everything regardless of what it is. It's not all about big mega corporations or greedy content creators or even hack journalists. There's a lot of issues with the actual development of games in general. With the many years of games being made, most of it's already been done before. It's clear that some studios are struggling to come up with something fresh and original and end up trying to make hybrid games. I mean, just how many ways can you do a first-person shooter or a real-time strategy? And how are franchises like Final Fantasy going to top the stories of something like Final Fantasy 7 or 8? Even if you manage to release a game that actually works, there's no guarantee that what you come up with is actually going to be what people want to play. There's a lot of games now that are suffering an identity crisis. They don't really know what they are, just taking from several different genres and smushing them together. Some have pointed out that many of the older, more experienced game developers have left these studios, and that's the reason for the decline in quality. But then does that mean that the newer developers are not as creative or as good? I see a lot of video games now padding the playtime. Rather than making compelling gameplay loops and stories, more and more developers are filling the game with a lot of bloat, adding in hundreds of side quests, and season after season, and let's just add crafting to every game. In the past, you would make an amazing game that lasted a certain amount of time, and then people would want to replay that game because it was so good. That's where the hours came from. The Hitman Trilogy reboot is a good example of this. Tons of missions with hundreds of ways to complete them, as you choose to. The replayability is built into the game. The hours of fun decided by you, rather than games like Diablo or Call of Duty or Battlefield, or even Helldivers 2 to some degree, trying to stretch and elongate the amount of time you play the game with gimmicks or, as we've said, borrowing tropes from different genres. And this is a response in some ways to gamers pointing out the lack of endgame content. It's given the idea that games need to last for thousands of hours, that you should be playing them for the rest of your lives. And the result is a lot of dead space and rushed and poor quality content. Another issue plaguing games now is progression. Balancing progression in a game is so important. It's what gives you the reason to keep playing a game, not just telling you to progress for the sake of it. Here's an XP bar, here's your level, now grind. The progression system needs to be satisfying and encouraging, and not just making you OP with a few simple meta mechanics, or loadouts, or whatever it is. Again, the key here is balanced. And just like rushed, poor quality content, a poorly thought out progression system can be just as detrimental to a game. I know this is quite a mopey and negative video. Maybe you can help out us grumps. What video games have you played recently that you think are great? Let us know in the comments of any hidden gems that you found, and help someone get out of their gaming slump. I found many of the games in the last few years have not really held my attention like games did in the past. I haven't felt connected to the franchises that I used to really enjoy. Is it the new generation of self-important developers? The greedy publishers squeezing as much money out of the players as possible? Or the influence-peddling journalists sucking the life out of the industry? I don't know, but I find myself going back to much older games more and more. Although there are a few breakthrough titles. And as many people said from the previous video, there are many indie titles that can fill that need that some of the disillusioned gamers are feeling. While there has been a bit of a dark cloud over the industry recently, there have been signs of some positive change. There are much more people now saying, hey, hang on, enough's enough. And this does really come down to us as gamers. The only way these companies are going to change is if we learn to respond to them accordingly. This means not being sucked in by the hype of an upcoming release, waiting a few weeks after a game is actually playable before deciding on whether to purchase it or not. There's almost no reason to be pre-ordering games anymore. Pre-orders were used to reserve copies of popular games because they would run out, but that's not the case now. That's up to us. If we keep buying into these products and allowing these companies to take advantage of us with these monetization practices like pre-order incentives, DLC, season passes and battle passes, they're not going to change as long as you're still buying it. I said in the previous video that we're on the precipice of change, and that is now starting to happen, and there could be some really great games on the horizon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.